Our agenda. So we've got a pretty good agenda here. So we'll start out with the keynote. We have coffee breaks between the sessions. We have a lunch break between 12 and 1, and another coffee break in the afternoon. We'll wrap up here at 5 o'clock today. So please use the coffee breaks and lunch with that. Wanted to say a quick thank you to our sponsors and our partners who generous support helped make this happen today. And also to our conference committee who put a huge amount of work organizing and making this happen. So a quick note about the facilities. We have a bathrooms out down around the corner there. There's also a water fountain where you can fill up your water bottles. Lunch will be served upstairs. So there's stairs and an elevator to get up there. To be served out on the terrace. There's also a few restrooms as well. Originally, they requested masks in the lobby. We were informed that this is actually optional, so you do not have to wear masks anywhere. No food out in the common areas. We do request that when you eat, you guys eat and drink down here, as well as upstairs. And please post about your experience on LinkedIn. So then, without taking much more of your time, I wanted to share with you guys I'll introduce our opening speaker. Our opening speaker is Gordon Gill. So Gordon Gill is the founding partner of award-winning Chicago design firm Adrian Smith and Gordon Gill Architecture. His work includes the design of the world's first net zero skyscraper, the Pearl River Tower in Guangzhou, the world's first large-scale positive energy building, the Masdar headquarters designed for Abu Dhabi, UAE, the world's tallest tower, Jeddah Tower in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and the Al Wasl Plaza, the open central space for the Expo 2020 in Dubai, featuring an intricate dome trellis that is the world's largest immersive projection experience. Gordon also designs smaller cultural spaces like the recently completed Yard at Chicago Shakespeare Theater, the Chicago Architecture Center, and the Steppenwolf Theater campus expansion. Gordon's work is driven by his philosophy that there is a purposeful relationship between formal design and performance, and that there is a language of performance, which is the basis of his practice. Form follows performance. So thank you all for joining us, and please give me a warm welcome for our opening keynote speaker, Gordon Gill. Yep. Yeah, you can forward. There's a clicker right there.
Good morning. Can you hear me? All right. I'm going to ask Anthony Viola from our office to join me as well for the presentation. And thank you, Anthony, for the introduction. That's old. So yes, same guy.
Can you talk a little bit louder?
Sure. Is that better?
Yeah.
I can hold it closer. This is Anthony Viola, one of our senior architects in the office. We're going to run through a couple of things for you in the next 20 minutes, and I did if we run long, just give us the hook. We're going to start here with the Decarb plan that we did 15 years ago for the city of Chicago. At the time, you might have remembered that we had signed up for the Planetary Challenge, and we just wanted to understand how that was going to happen. So we took about $500,000 of our own money, and 30 people went out and basically scoped the entire inner core. And did a 280-page document that we published at the time for the decarbonization of Chicago. We're just talking a little bit about maybe it's time to refresh that document and see where we actually are today. So that would be kind of fun. The whole upshot of this was really for us to unpack the systems of the city and repack them in a mutually supportive manner. We are a systems-based architectural firm. We designing as well as architecture, interior architecture, and so we can use it for us on the carbon. We'll wrap this up by showing you what all these projects that we look at. We're not big fans of offsets, to be honest. We know that offsets are part of the process, but what we're really focused on is getting the embodied carbon out of the building as much as we can, the cities as much as we can. We like the on-site effort. We could have at the time paid a couple $2 billion and taken the city off the grid by floating, PVs out of the lake or putting some wind turbines in a. Oh, that was interesting. There you go. Yeah, that's better. Or putting wind turbines on a couple hundred acres somewhere out in the west, but we are always most interested in actually improving the qualities of the environments that we work in and improving the cities. At the time, the core was about 10% residential. And what we found by looking at this research was really that the mixed use communities, as you probably all know, is probably the best carbon approach from an efficiency standpoint. And so it was fun to see the core of the city over the years begin to develop this kind of mixed use program and introduce residential into different kinds of buildings that were available. The upshot of this was 15 years ago or so that we could prove that we could actually increase density and reduce carbon, because density is, of course, as we all know now, in hand in glove with carbon footprint. Density is good, and it just has to be designed in a fashion or thought of in a fashion that this is a critical way of reducing carbon footprint. So what we were focused on at the time was looking at scenarios that we could run for different buildings in the city. What we're focused on now, I'll show you this at the end, is what looking at different scenarios for infrastructure. We actually believe that there's a great connection, obviously, between buildings and infrastructure. We actually see the buildings as an infrastructure when we're doing master planning and work and designing cities. At the time, we were looking at the leveraging of the existing building stock. Everybody knows the existing building stock is a key component of reducing carbon footprint. We actually have a challenge right now in our city with our core and existing building stock and picking the way that's being utilized and used. And what we don't want are stranded assets. So we have stranded assets in our infrastructure right now as it relates to existing building stock because it's underutilized. So what we need to do is give that existing building stock an injection and figure out how to get it moving. So from a carbon standpoint, that's critical. We took that effort 15 years ago and this latest master plan, which was actually provided for the World Expo that ran for the last 6 months and recently wrapped itself up. We did the legacy plan for the expo, and we wrote all the sustainable standards for it. We wrote all the master planning guidelines for the expo, and we were invited to do the centerpiece of the expo, which I'll show you today. This was a very interesting approach for Divide because there are no buildings in this master plan that are over 11 stories. So although this is dense, it's low. We are now in a position where we're looking at creating a walkable city. And for those of you who might remember Masdar in Abu Dhabi, which didn't really go the way they wanted it to go, which we explained way back when in terms of walkability. If the master plan isn't supporting the building stock and the master plan and the vision for the infrastructure is not actually supporting the carbon footprint, there's no architecture you can build a rule that's going to overcome that. You're digging yourself out of a hole constantly. What we were able to do here was actually reverse engineer the carbon footprint for the infrastructure. What do I mean by that? When we first got there, they were on the way down the road with infrastructure already. They asked us to take a look at it, and what we did was write standards for the architecture that through its performance actually required less infrastructure. And so, according to their numbers, we saved them $400 million in about 4 months of analysis because they weren't considering the end use or life cycle use of the buildings as they were designing the infrastructure. We went on to do these 5 buildings and a centerpiece. There's some eye candy in here for the project. We won't, spend too much time on this, but what this is 3 office buildings, 2 hotels, and a central park. So the central space of this development will be a park that is now shaded by that large trellis that used to be there. And that trellis is exactly the dimension from Dearborn to Clark. It's 130 meters. And I can tell you walk that space ad nauseum for 5 years, figuring out the scale of this thing. It is a immersive space, so it's a kind of fun technological experience. It's the world's largest immersive space, of course, it's in Dubai. And the trellis itself creates its own microclimate for the park, so it's usable in a much larger way than it would be in the desert at 120 degrees ambient temperature. The way we did this was to really understand the microclimates associated with this. And the reason I'm telling you all of this stuff is not because, yes, we are proud of the project, but
The key for it was really to how to get the carbon footprint out of here, how to make the space usable. And we had some pretty incredible successes with this as we looked at, as I said before, unpack the entire systems of the project and repacked it. So these are some of the targets we were able to achieve. We're about 77% less energy than a typical body building. We are about 119% of their own electricity through photovoltaics. We took about 1,000 tons of CO2 through the carbon analysis on an annual basis on this project. I'll skip the next couple, but the one that really was, I think, key for buy was the 73% less potable water. So if you look at the buying of desalination, the billions of dollars that are being spent on desalination, we explained to them that if their entire district was doing this, and if every building in the body was doing this, they could take that money that they were spending on desalination and invest it in things like medical care, hospitals, other kinds of things, education that they need. The equation around carbon was a good one. It's an economic equation. We argue that if it doesn't make economic sense, no one's really going to do it. So when we present the buildings, and we're always presenting them, I would say primarily from an architectural standpoint, embedded in the architecture is this carbon analysis. And then we reveal the carbon analysis to explain why the building looks like that, why we design it like that, how it gets operated, and all of this is life cycle. The three office buildings are all before. We did that with no additional cost. So the whole notion that this costs more to do it is, I'll just say baloney. I'll just say it's baloney. It's not true that this is overly complicated and horribly expensive and doesn't make economic sense. We proved it in these buildings. We've been asked back, as a matter of fact, I had to decline a meeting this morning because I'm here with you. I'd rather be here with you because we're going to be talking to them. They want us to come back and do the entire legacy plan for all of the buildings in the master plan. So that will be a fun project. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the adaptive reuse of the expo. Because we designed it as a legacy piece, we beg them, please don't go in there and just bulldoze the whole thing when you're done, which they did not do because they appreciated the plan. So now we're going to do adaptive reuse and infill. This makes sense. If you think of our core and you think of our building stock that we have in our core right now, we need adaptive reuse and infill. That's what we really need to be looking at for embodied carbon and stranded assets. As I mentioned, we're pretty rigorous and pretty aggressive about the carbon stuff in the work in the office. We're down to the details on the carbon footprint and how we design the details of the buildings. And we hope at the end of the day that they end up being kind of fun and hopefully beautiful spaces for people to occupy. We do this for every building that we engage. And over the years, 15 years, we've grown up and graduated from energy to embodied carbon. And on the big guys, such as Wuhan Greenland Center, we have different strategies that we talk about how to reduce energy.
Sure. This is actually a project a little bit earlier in the office than the Expo project, and it started off as a competition, which is, I think, important to note just because it's a very compressed time period. So in this case, we're working very quickly on the conceptual nature of the tower as it relates to performance and culture and context. And in those early decision-making processes, which is probably 5 or 6 weeks, we have to come up with very concise principles about how we could reduce embodied carbon in this case. So we said it's a tall tower. You have to do shaping to reduce the structural embodied carbon in the structural system. We do that with a variety of strategies. So this is a strategy that we developed in the competition, and it permeated even through all the design iterations that we did. And an important note to that is that we collaborate very closely with the structural engineers, and in this case, wind engineering, to test those things. So this is 2012, and we're doing physical wind tunnel models to understand what the shaping of the building, openings in the building, tapering, and shaping of the top does to the efficiency of the structural system. And that is at the macro level, from the overall building, but it's also, in design features. You can see this is just early CFD studies, which are through one of these notches. And when you're talking about the structural system saving a potential 15% of the total structural system, that's everything, rebar, structural steel, concrete. And when you put it to scale, the size of the workers next to the embedded steel in some of these columns, 15% is a huge amount of embodied carbon. And it's important maybe to also note that we're doing this at the same time as we're designing the rest of the building, right? So in this case, as we're flexing the building for wind performance, we're also looking at fabrication, reducing the amount of unique panels to reduce waste in the fabrication. We're also looking at details and the efficient way to do the detailing for the building. And also, all the complement of sustainability and evaluation of things like sun shading. And this is a detail of the construction. And this is a photo, most recent photo of it being completed. Back to you.
I think also that one of the conversations we want to have before we wrap it up is really about the process that we employ for all building types, all scales, master plans, material selection, as it relates to embodied carbon. So when Anthony talks about venting the buildings, which we did from Pearl River Tower 20 years ago, and the notion of creating stability or efficiency in the structure by reducing 50% or more of the actual infrastructure of the building, we're taking concrete and steel out of it, but we're taking cost out of it as well. The embodied carbon strategy that we have signed up to do for some of these projects is pretty intense. We took 5 years since we did the Decarb plan, and we're going to publish this book. It's being released now. It's called the Residency Study. We took 5 years and studied 9 different typologies of residential uses in this region, and I basically unpacked it for every possible aspect of the buildings and its use. The 9 top typologies range from single family, 2,000 single family homes in a suburban concept, all the way to the mega tall on one side. And what we took into consideration there was land use as well. Things like the mailman, the mail route, snow plowing, backyard fences, the works, elevating cords, obviously all the infrastructure that goes into making these communities work. It was a little bit surprising that when you look at the kind of carbon density of typologies, you might assume that the mid-rise guys were the best, and they are, until you start to have this conversation about land use. And this goes back to the whole conversation about density in the Decarb plan, when we learned about density and carbon, that you have to consider the full equation in the life cycle of our planet, quite frankly. If you're going to come up with an equation about why we're doing something that makes sense. We might think we're doing something that makes sense today, but if we don't walk that equation all the way down to its life cycle, we may find that we could end up kicking ourselves in the butt about 15, 20 years from now because we missed an opportunity or missed an understanding of how the life cycle actually functions. So when we talk about embodied carbon, what we're talking about today is life cycle. So we'll wrap up with this project, and this project was started as an analysis for a tech company in California, who shall remain nameless, but they signed up with their $20 billion commitment to retroactively erase their carbon footprint from the planet, which goes back to 1986 or so. They hired us with an assumption that they were going to go down a path and knock this building out. And from this day forth, everything was going to be wood. This is where you kick us all out. Because yes, that's a reasonable assumption, but it's not exactly accurate unless you run the life cycle and you can guarantee the recycling of that structure. So we tested wood, steel, concrete for a 350,000 square foot office building in California for this tech company. we started by doing the same thing we did in the Decarb plan. We unpacked the building. And we reorganized the building in order to do all the things that you see on the screen and optimize the functionality of it. So when we do this stuff, the first thing we're doing is we're going to put you in a position of passive success prior to looking at a technological solution. The equations around it were based on, in this particular case, how they work, how they want to work in the future. I remember this was like right before the pandemic. So when we asked the question about what is an office building of the future, we had a lot of discussion about that. All of the analysis we did in the office just up the street here on the road. And we took about 4 months to walk them through what we think we could achieve for them. You want to talk about some of the analysis, the lights, or?
Sure, yeah, one thing about what Gordon was saying is that, that all of the sort of, the targets and KPIs that we set were actually done as a carbon study before we even started designing the building. So when we started to look at building stock, we said, okay, well, if our target is that we have to have, daylit spaces, we really have to design all of the spaces. How would we design buildings that would respond to that? And in this case, designing the spaces, not only for the width, the depth of the leaf span, but also for, in this case, looking at the opacity or the window to wall ratio. How it affected daylight in the space and glare. And it really narrowed down design choices between, how the window would be broken up, but also how shading elements would even need to be implemented or not implemented. And that analysis stretched to using analysis to understand how much PV power we're going to be able to produce on site. One of the things that we were tracking was in the daylight studies and the leaf span studies was operational carbon, and that was easy for us to come up with a budget of saying this is how much operational carbon or EUI we're going to use, and then we had a budget to say this is how much energy we needed to produce, and we needed to do that analysis.
So in a lot of the requirements that cities have that we work in, for example, we work in Toronto, we work in Boston, we work in a couple of cities, few cities in the United States. The carbon target is sometimes, not all the time, sometimes operational. So for example, if we're in Boston, the picture is 40% reduction in operational carbon. Okay. In Toronto, it's 20%. Okay, great. Congratulations. I mean, the problem that we have is that we're still kind of timid about what is being requested from the design community. Meanwhile, we think the design community, yourselves included, are chomping at the bit to knock this thing out of the park. And we can. And that's what we did here. We didn't, there's no offsets here. We can just pick through them. I can tell you guys. From a material standpoint, we did some research on what we can do with concrete and steel. This ends up being a concrete building. Let's go to the next one. There's the analyses that we ran, and the punchline is that we can get to net zero carbon in 7.9 years. Right, that's the payback. So when we showed this to them with a concrete building, they couldn't believe it because obviously from a cost standpoint, this was going to make a ton of sense for them. Not everybody has access to a forest. We were all around the world. No one in Dubai is going to go cut down, retroactively cut down a forest to build a place. It's not going to happen. It's a lovely idea, but it's not going to work. Concrete, as you know, is everywhere. And when we talk about materials, we're not just talking about buildings. Yes, we're architects, but for those of you who are infrastructure engineers and designers, talk to us about the roads, talk to us about the sewers, talk to us about the drainage systems. You're going to do those out of wood? I don't think so. What are we really trying to say? So the message we want to review is, let's just take a deeper look, think about a global strategy, really look at the common sense solutions around us, and let's design for it. It's absolutely achievable. from our perspective. Did you want to-
No, the only thing I'll add is that, what this process and what the board is talking about is designing efficiency first, right? That's through the design process, that's performance embedded in the design process. And then that's embodied, right? And then we can also, with working with engineers, reduce our operational. So now we're doing the next step of doing the least bad, right? But what this graph is showing you is that we have to then do our best to generate power on site. If we want to hit targets like zero embodied carbon for the building by 2030, the only way that we're going to do that is by it's doing
That's really good. And it takes the entire group to do it. This is not an architectural thing. This is not, it's everybody is doing it. So when we start the work, we invite everybody to the table, and we won't start the job unless all the consultants are up to that. I think we're.
Tom, I think we got time for one question if we have from the audience while we get set up for the next session.
We're going to be elected mayor of Chicago tomorrow.
Not running.
We wanted to begin to apply some of your principles around process, not necessarily part of the. What are some of your thoughts?
Could you repeat the question for the people online?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, if we were in the mayor's position, what are some of the steps that we would be taking to look at the core of the city? Frankly, I think we have to address the core. I think we have, from a population standpoint, seen a departure from the inner core of the city, which we know from our 20,007 work represents about 10% of the carbon footprint in the density of the core. I'm talking about the core as defined by the river. The equation around carbon, as I mentioned, is also economic. So we need to put those buildings back into use. We need to make sure that we're not left with an asset of infrastructure that's underutilized. Sometimes we do presentations where we talk about the cities that we've designed and built and all of it as the barrier reefs of our built environment. And these areas have their own ecosystem. A financial ecosystem, a social ecosystem, a political ecosystem, and a carbon ecosystem. So my goal would be to go after the problems from a carbon footprint standpoint, go after the lives of those buildings and get them infused one way or another. In 2007, when we did this, we began to identify specific buildings that we thought were better used for residential. This was a Class B, Class C office that were double hung in the 1800s and early 60s, and then nailed shut, full of air conditioning, and turned into office buildings, and then failed as office building products. We would like to repurpose and adaptively use the core. And I think that's absolutely feasible. In fact, I think given the way programming and approach to public open space and the kind of injection of technology into these buildings today, we could absolutely get a kind of high charge, functional, fantastic city that's mutually supportive of all aspects of life that is carbon friendly. That's where I started.
Thank you very much. Really great. Really always impressed to see what Chicago businesses can do around the world in terms of setting the bar. That was really important to us today to represent kind of the best Chicago exports around the world. What was also really important to us was to kind of showcase what we are doing here locally, here in the state of Illinois, in Cook County, and the city of Chicago. So one of the ways and tools that we have for doing that is through policy. So our first session here is focused on policy. We have a really, really great set of moderators and panelists